Good evening and welcome to Barnes & Noble Union Square. I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight on this special occasion. This evening we're delighted to have Daniel Boorstin with us. He is the author of the national bestsellers, The Discoverers and The Creators and The American, a trilogy that won the Francis Parkham Prize, the Bancroft Prize, and the Pulitzer Prize. In 1989, he received the National Book Award for his lifetime contribution to literature. He was the director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, and for 12 years he served as the Librarian of Congress. We are delighted to have him here tonight to discuss his latest work, The Seekers, the story of man's continuing quest to understand his world. So ladies and gentlemen, will you please join me in welcoming Mr. Daniel Boorstin.
Can you hear me now a little better? I want to thank you all for coming, and also thank Barnes & Noble for being our host tonight. It's a great pleasure to be here in this, I don't know how to characterize it, a wilderness of books, a desert of books, a forest of books, a garden of books. But it is a wonderful place to be, and it's a reminder that the book is still very much alive. And that's particularly encouraging to an author. Now, this evening, I would like to talk for a few minutes, and then I hope there'll be some questions. I'd be delighted to hear them. I don't promise to be able to answer them, but I'd like to hear them. And I'm sure you must have many questions. This evening, we are celebrating the appearance of the third volume in a work that I've spent about a quarter of a century on, really a kind of a history of Western achievement. And I enjoyed doing it, and I'm going to talk very briefly about how I came to it, and then invite your questions. There are this book is called The Seekers, and is the third of a trilogy which began with The Discoverers, which is a history of the sciences in the West, and The Creators, which is a history of all the arts. And The Seekers is a search for meaning. It's a history of the why in the West. I would say that there are two leading themes in the book, which come from interesting and very disparate authors. One is expressed in a sentence of Cervantes, an author whom we all know, in which Cervantes says, "The road is always better than the inn." I-N-N. And that is one of the themes. A second theme, which is not unrelated to that, is one that I would find expressed in The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, a book which I'm sure many of you know, by B. Traven. And the theme of that book is expressed in the story of its leading actors. You may remember two men meet casually, accidentally, in a Mexico City public garden, and they join together in a common quest, and they devote themselves to each other, and were passionate friends, and sacrificed for their risked their lives for each other, in fact, until they found gold, and then they they had found what they were seeking, or they thought they found what they thought they were seeking, and that was the end, and then they murdered each other, which suggests a larger theme, and that is that the seeking is what unites people and brings all humanity together, but the finding divides. And the more passionately people believe that they have found, which is expressed in the more fanatical believers in whatever religion, is one of the things that divides our humanity. Now, how did I come to write this work, The Seekers? Well, as I said, it's the climax of a trilogy, but my love affair with history began many years ago. In fact, it began when I was an undergraduate at Harvard in the 1930s, and it was awakened by a wonderful book which I hope to entice all you to if you haven't already read it, and that is Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. That book charmed me, and I had the good fortune to be inducted to it. It's a great book by a great teacher, F.O. Matheson, whose writings on American literature some of you may know. I've also had the good fortune, having been inspired by Gibbon, to have the companionship, the inspiration, and editing of my wife, Ruth Borston, who is here tonight, and without whom I don't think I could have done any of these things. But she's too modest to accept the responsibility, or maybe is too shrewd, who can tell. Now, I have also been led along by what I would call the amateur spirit. And I think the amateur spirit has been very much disparaged, and improperly so, by people who identify the amateur spirit with the bungler or the unprofessional. But I would describe the amateur spirit as being understood from its Latin root, amo amare, to love. The amateur is a lover and does the work for the love of it. That is to be distinguished from the attitude of the professional, who tends to write for other professionals, or for the bureaucrat, who follows established procedures and is always waiting for an established retirement at the end. But that the spirit of the amateur is also expressed as the opposite of that of the bureaucrat. And the bureaucrat's idea, leading idea, is found in a motto that is said to have been inscribed over the desk of a French civil servant, and it said, "Never do anything for the first time," which is an exercise of caution, I think, and advice of caution, but is not the spirit of the amateur, who is willing to rush in and do what he wants for the love of it. So I was led to the amateur spirit's way of interpreting American civilization by having spent a few years in England as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, and having been impressed with the difference between the American experience and the Old World or British experience. And the word experience had a special meaning to me then, being something that was very different from ideology or dogma or faith, for that matter. So I then wrote 3 volumes, which some of you may know, called The Americans, which was about the American experience, first the colonial experience, then the national experience, and after that the democratic experience. And those works were concerned with the meaning of what went on in the world to individual people. It was the meaning of a fluid world is what experience leads us to. And as I wrote more about America, I was impressed with how fluid the world is, and also that there is no such thing as trivia in history, which is something that we need hardly to be reminded of these days if we read the newspapers or follow the media. But having done that, why I wanted to reach out to deprovincialize myself and try to write about the world. And I remember, well, it was an evening when Ruth and I had arrived had gone up to the Zugspitze outside Munich, and the train that was supposed to take us back down was delayed, and we reflected on what would happen next after the Americans. And we decided that it would be a good thing to try, rather rashly, to write a world history from the Western point of view. And that's what I undertook, and that's what I've been doing for the last 25 years. A work that's focused not on wars and empires, but on human fulfillment. And those of you who've read some of the books know that each of the 3 volumes is concerned with a different aspect of human fulfillment. The discoverers, all the sciences, with the fulfillment by the search to know. The creators by the search to make the new. Man as a knower and as a maker. And now the seekers, which is a search for meaning. The search to know the why. And the search for the why, which I describe in in my own way in The Seekers, begins with Job, and it ends with Einstein. It is something that expresses the will of all of us, because although we may not all be discoverers or creators, we are all seekers. All want to know why. And that history of the why is what you will find I pursue in the book which is you have before you this evening. Now, as I chronicled the seekers, I had to be very selective, very extremely selective, and I had to select those seekers who still speak to me, and I hope will speak to you. Because since everybody is a seeker, it's hard to know whom to select, and I chose the ones that were most eloquent and seemed to be more awakening to me. The important thing about a seeker is not what he answers, but what he asks, not what he finds, but his way of seeking. And the Seekers, as you will note, has three divisions. I begin with an ancient heritage, which starts with the Hebrew prophets and the Greek philosophers and their way of seeking. And then the Christian way, which is also part of that, also an experiment in community, which was pursued in the church, in monasteries, and in the universities, and then which was expressed in a variety of Protestant faiths, in the works of Erasmus and Luther and Calvin, which are familiar to all of us. But after the ancient heritage, there was a period of communal seeking, and that is expressed in the liberal spirit. The belief that if the community as a whole, somehow or other, will find a way to ask the basic questions of humanity. And that began with, I see seeds of that in the Greeks, who found the questions of experience dramatized in ancient myths, which are beautifully recalled to us in Homer, which we all know, and then was expressed in the writings of the first Greek historians, who were the founders of the writing of history in the West, Herodotus and Thucydides especially. So this was the foundation of what I call the liberal way, the way of asking about the purpose of our existence and the end of our existence in community, and finding that community was an avenue to to the way of answering the meaning of our existence. And this was expressed very much in the West in a person whose writings many of you know and about whom I've written a bit, Thomas Jefferson, who found in the American Philosophical Society, of which he was one of the founders and the leading spirit, a way of using the American experience to awaken mankind to new possibilities in man. That was the communal search. And I give a rather, I would say, uncharitable bow to Hegel, who also had his theories about how humankind as a whole could seek the answers. But then after the liberal spirit, oddly enough, the liberal spirit was part of the spirit of science and belief in the possibilities of science, which produced the writings of Kant and Karl Marx and others who found a science of history, what is called historicism, the effort to interpret history according to an ideology, a simple scheme of some kind. And this scheme then would provide us all paths to the future, which led so many thoughtful people to wonder whether it was possible to mark off those paths, since man was so unpredictable and so subtle and so elusive. That led to people to find different ways, which I would call sanctuaries of doubt, ways of doubting the possibility of simple answers. Examples are familiar, Carlyle and Emerson, who thought that the power of the individual personality was such that it made us doubt any simple generalizations about the future. And the existentialists, Kierkegaard, who turned from history to existence. And also, in my idol, the person whose writings I admire more, I think, than that of any other philosopher or would-be philosopher, William James, who invented the idea of streams of consciousness as a way of emphasizing the fluidity of experience. But there were many ways of expressing this doubt. One of the more popular ones, which is found on the stage and in the theater of the absurd, in the writings of Samuel Beckett and others. But the modern movement, the modern fulfillment of man's seeking, it seems to me, is in the seeking for meaning, is in the seeking itself. The idea of a world in process is what I find most engaging. And that idea is expressed in some of the other people whom I describe in The Seekers. Lord Acton, who's well known for his generalizations about history, but who was very subtle in his treating with the French Revolution and other revolutions. André Malraux, who wrote what he called about the anti-destiny, and he saw art as an anti-destiny, a way of expressing the possibilities of mankind that could not be captured in any ideology. They were followed by Bergson, whose creative evolution was a fulfillment, a way of translating the Darwinian ideology or historicism into a catalog of unpredictables, mainly based on a new concept of time, which you will see described in the book, because Bergson had the insight that it's a great mistake to allow a mechanism, the machine, to divide our units of time, when the important thing about time is duration, the embodiment of every previous minute in the later minute. And duration is the expression of the élan vital, which was what Bergson thought expressed man's way of fulfilling himself in evolution. And then I finally come to someone whom we would perhaps not think of as an expresser of this aspect of the meaning of seeking, meaning in the seeking. And that is Albert Einstein, who is the concluding great figure in my book. And Einstein observed that the individual feels the futility of human desires and aims, and the subtlety and marvelous order which reveal themselves both in nature and in the world of thought. The contrariety between how simple it is in ourselves and how complex and subtle it is in the world out there. Individual existence, he said, is a sort of prison. And man wants to experience the universe as a single significant whole. And that was Einstein's quest. And he insisted that he would work indefinitely in the sciences. He said, I'd never become an evil renegade because I do not wish physics to be based on mere probabilities. Also, I find very touching and expressive of the concern of all of us for the search for meaning. In the last words that Einstein is reputed to have said on his deathbed, which was reported by his son, he said, "If I only had more mathematics." That was his own expression of his own sense of incompleteness and of his belief in the perpetual need to seek. It was fortunate that Einstein lived when he did, as I point out in my concluding chapters, because the mechanistic physics of Newton had been proved inadequate by the electrodynamics of Maxwell and Faraday. And that suggested openings that had never been imagined before, which were very well expressed in an excellent book by Freeman Dyson called Infinite in All Directions, in which he shares with H.G. Wells the discovery of the future. And Wells, who was a very popular but also a very subtle and profound writer, said, "Worlds may freeze and suns may perish, but there stirs something within us now that can never die again. We are at the beginning of the greatest change that humanity has ever undergone. There is no shock, no epoch-making incident. But then there's no shock at a cloudy daybreak. At no point can we say, here it commences. Last minute was night and now it's morning. But insensibly, we are in the day. What we can see and imagine gives us a measure and gives us faith for what surpasses the imagination." And that is the theme on which I would like to end, and we're glad to welcome your questions about any of the volumes, and especially about The Seekers, which some of you have in your hand. Thank you. Please, yes.
In your speech, obviously I've not studied your book, but in your presentation,
Would you stand up? I can hear you better, I think, if you just stand and talk. I think I can hear you.
focus on Western thought.
Yes.
And also it seems as though there's a definite progress from Moses to Einstein, if you will.
Yes.
Is that sense of progress uniquely Western? And how would you generalize, why would you exclude Eastern thought?
Why would I
Exclude Eastern thought?
exclude? I don't exclude Eastern thought, but I'm writing about something that I'm familiar with, and that's why I focus on the West. But I do have a chapter near the beginning of the book on evil in the East, which is an example of how different is the universe of Eastern thought from that of the West, because the problem, Job's problem, was the problem of explaining how a God who was omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent could allow the existence of evil. That was a puzzling problem, and one which he never found an answer to. But our fellow human beings in the East, Buddhists and Hindus, do not have quite that problem, because if you believe in a kind of polytheistic universe, and believe that there is an evil god, a Kali, or some other god who expresses the conflicting forces of the world, then you have no problem. You see the world in conflict. But that's a very large universe. I don't read the Eastern languages. I don't read Sanskrit. But I thought it was a sufficient assignment, if not too large an assignment, to take on the search for meaning in the West. Yes.
My knowledge of political theory is pretty thin, not just compared to yours, but absolutely. But I was curious, I've always generally associated liberalism with an emphasis on the individual. So I found it interesting here that you put under the Book 2 communal search category, the liberal way.
Yes. Well, I identify the liberal way with the belief that the community, as a community, can find its own way toward the values that the society should fulfill. And well, that's what I define as the liberal way. Does that seem inadequate to you? I see the liberal way as the way of bringing people together in community in a common search for the ends of their community. And that's expressed in the people I mentioned, some of whom I find more congenial than others. Voltaire is one whom I especially value and revere, and I also relate that to the concept of civilization. Civilization as a quest, as a way of seeking what is common to humankind. Would you want to go on? Is that it? That at least suggests the way I think of the liberalism way. And I would also distinguish the liberal way is the way I think of openness, of belief that there are things, there are possibilities in the world which we cannot understand, and which that may be reserved for future generations to know. Sure, Miss. Yes, please.
Can this thesis be applied today in a world that? Can this thesis be applied today in a world that's marked by religious fundamentalism and what I would call micro-ethnocentricity?
I can't hear what you're saying. I'm sorry.
Can your thesis be applied today in today's world that is marked by religious fundamentalism and what I would call micro-ethnocentricity, the smallest groups of people claiming...
I can't hear what you're saying. I'm sorry. Would you speak a little louder? Here we are. All right. Here we are.
Here we go. Here's the answer. Can you hear me now?
Yes, all right, please.
Can your thesis...
That's better, thank you.
The assumptions in your fine book be applied today in today's world that I think we can agree is marked by religious fundamentalism.
Yes.
And what could also be termed as micro-ethnocentricity. So the practical application of your book in today's world.
Well, I am very wary of all fundamentalisms, of all ideologies. An ideology is a formula that someone believes will explain the way the world works or ought to work. And one of the leading ideologies of modern times, of course, is Marxism. And Marx was a very subtle and a penetrating student of history, and opened many things to us which we hadn't known. But he also left a legacy of ideology, of people who believed, he insisted more than once that he was not a Marxist, because he believed in the quest. But he did think that he had arrived at some solutions to the great questions of history. And that, I think, is what we must be wary of, the belief that anyone has the answer. And that's why the theme of the book, as I suggest at the very outset, is to go from the seeking for meaning to finding meaning in the seeking. And that's what brings us here together this evening. We're all asking why, and that brings us together. But if someone were here to preach to you about the dogma of what the ultimate answer would be, I think we would lose quite a lot of the audience. That's not what brings people together. And I think that the keynote of the modern spirit, which I say is expressed by William James eloquently and in others, and to a certain extent by Andre Malraux, is the belief that the meaning comes in the seeking, that what brings us together, what enables us to find our humanity, is coming together to ask, what is our humanity? And that is not an easy question. And the easy answers are not the ones that stay with us very long, nor should they. Please.
Well, a person does need some answers. You have to have a philosophy of life. But what you should do is realize that while you're acting under this philosophy, someone else might have something better, and you should be open to new ideas. But to say that you shouldn't have any ideas or believe in anything is wrong, because you have to have some ideas. But
well, of course, we have to have ideas, and it's a good thing that we do. But I'm putting a question mark beside any ideology, beside any set of beliefs that pretend to be the final answer. That is what ideology is, because it's ideology that leads people to kill one another over disagreements about ideas, or about faith, or about the end of the world, or about the nature of God. And that is that's something else. But I think that we all ask why, and I think that we are all satisfied with imperfect answers, and we should be, because that's what makes us human and what keeps us in the stream of human history. The common quest is what brings us all together, East and West, and all the races of the world are in their way of questing.
Hi, Dr. Boorstin. First of all, I've read most of your other books, so I want to just take this opportunity to thank you, because I've been tremendously enriched by your writings. I haven't read The Seekers, and so I don't know whether you address Sigmund Freud, but where would you put Sigmund Freud in this gallery of major seekers of the West?
Yes. Well, I deal with Sigmund Freud among the discoverers and the creators, but I deal with him as a humanist rather than as a person who provides the ultimate scientific answer to questions. He saw aspects of humanity and of human experience which other people had not, and gave it a form which entices us. The value of it is in the questions that he asks, and the menace, the danger of it is in the belief that he has all the answers. And that's the difference between the Freudian vision and the Freudian dogma. Did you want to pursue that?
Thank you very much. I believe that some years ago you contributed a term, the pseudo-event, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm wondering if a culture of pseudo-events is somewhat of an impediment to environment of seekers and questers.
Well, it's part of the human experience. Well, that was some years ago that I wrote this little book, which was called The Image, and I was led to it by an anecdote, which still is at the heart of the matter, I think. A lady is pushing a baby carriage in a park, and a friend comes up and says, "My, that's a beautiful baby you have there." And she says, "Well, that's nothing. You should see his picture." And that is the keynote of The Image, a book which explores the implications of technology and the possibility, the making of images, the implication of that for our control of the world. And that is, in that book, which I hope some of you will read, which is very much in print, and which has been very widely translated, and which in fact, interestingly enough, has had a special vogue in Japan, which is a country that has been very great in the making of images. The effect of the media, of the multiplication of media, as I suggest, is to create what I call the pseudo-event, which is the report, the emphasis on the report rather than on the experience. A pseudo-event well, an interview is a classic example of a pseudo-event. It is something which has not taken place, but which is suggestive of what might take place. And the development of the media, and especially the increase in images by television, and not to mention the daily press, of course, is a way of leading us to mistake the report of events from the experience itself. And that book was meant to be a cautionary book. It was not meant to be a dogma, but some of it has been taken as more dogmatic than it should have been. And I don't need to remind any of you of the ways in which the current episodes that we read about in the newspapers are reported as if they were great events having to do with the national interest. But really, they tend to be only activities that were reported and re-reported. That does not make them a part of the national concern. A pseudo-event is something that is reported and taken to be important because it is reported. Yes.
Washington is a town with which you have a great degree of familiarity.
Pardon?
Some have speculated that what's going on in Washington today is a conflict of factions, one of which is very much filled with its sense of having found the truth, and another which is unfortunately represented by someone who's seeking through self-indulgence and seeking towards pleasure. What do you think of the implications, not for the short term, but for the long term, for the country of this fight between these factions?
Well, I don't see the factions as you describe them. I see we have our two-party system, which is functioning very actively, but I don't see, I think the nation will survive. I think that's one of the great, it's a great strength of our representative government, is that it can include all kinds of people as representatives and allow them to conflict with each other and debate without going to the heart of the matter, without destroying our national institutions or our economy. So I don't. I think it also suggests something that I did mention a few minutes ago, and that is that there is no such thing as trivia in history. We can't say that there certain events will have no significance because they're too unimportant. There's no such thing as an unimportant event. Any event or any person can have an impact on large events in ways that we cannot even imagine. Also, I suggest that there's no such thing as a dead end in history. We think that some of these trivia are episodes that can be forgotten, but what happens in history is never forgotten.
We have time for one more question.
Yes?
Hi, I haven't read your book yet, but I'm actually curious about why you chose the plate that you did for the cover. That's a William Blake plate, and I believe it's called The Ancient of Days.
That's
and
right.
It's about a primal creator who is the figure Urizen. And later on, in later Blake, Urizen is the figure of law and dogma. And it seems to me to be anathema to your theme of seeking.
Well, I chose it because I like the looks of it. What better reason for choosing it? I wouldn't think of choosing it because I believed in what Blake believed in, because he believed in some very fantastic and peculiar things. But I thought it was an engaging and attractive cover, and I think some people do agree. It's attractive, and that's why I chose him. I'm not a Blake, a disciple of William Blake, nor do I wish to preach his doctrines to any of you, although he was a wonderful poet, and his poetry is what I find most attractive about him. Well, if there are no other questions, thank you very much for coming. And I hope you enjoy the book, and if you like it, write me. You can write me at the Library of Congress in Washington. Just care of the Library of Congress, Washington, D.C. zip is 20540, and I will look forward to having your comments if you like it, and also if you don't like it. Perhaps you can lead me to do better and suggest how I might do better next time. Thank you for coming.